All right, now there are tools out there that we can use to assist us with getting additional information from another web server, for instance. And we'll talk more about this too in the later modules when we talk about the web server and web applications. But here's a tool that's worth mentioning. It's called HTTP print, and it basically allows us to figure out what actual versions are running on a machine, and as in on a web machine. As you can see here, we got some results back from 3 different websites and what's actually running, as in what the banner grabbing information actually is and so forth. It can be run on the command line as well as the GUI interface, and basically is referred to as a fingerprinting tool, as in this case a web server fingerprinting tool. All right, now we can also do things like DNS enumeration. Now hopefully you remember that DNS runs off of port 53. So if we see port 53 out there, we can actually look at the NS lookup tool, for instance. We can also use other tools to allow us to go in and actually try to do a zone transfer and so forth. Now, any DNS server that is accessible from the internet can be queried to tell the hacker about server names and IP addresses. If the DNS server contains records for not only the DMZ servers, as in your demilitarized servers, but also internal servers, this could be a security hole. If the hacker is able to determine internal machine names, the hacker can then also find out the machine's IP addresses and so forth as well. Now we can also, of course, get this through mail, emails, and so forth, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Our countermeasure here is to have separate internal and external DNS servers. And here we see NS lookup. And I'm going to show you guys a demo on NS lookup so you can see it happening there as well. Important information about NS lookup is how to look up information regarding your DNS records. We talked about the DNS records earlier. We want to be able to look up things such as your whatever MX record for your mail record, right? And we use the set type to determine that, as in what we're specifically looking for and so forth. Again, let's take a peek into this and see what you get. Okay, now we know a little bit more about NS lookup and so forth. Again, the Unix version of that is called dig and such. All right, now the next thing up is the SNMP insecurities, right? This is going to be your simple network management protocol. The port number, 161. That's used to remotely manage TCP IP services, and there are basically two security issues with version 1 and 2. It's basically the community strings are going to be sent in clear text. Remember we talked about this as well? The community strings by default, public or private, public for read-only, private for read-write access. Best way to get around this is to use version 3 because it provides encryption. So here are the enumeration countermeasures. Blocks 161 and 162 on your firewalls. Remember we said 161 was for SNMP and 162 was for SNMP trap. You can implement SNMP version 3, which encrypts data and provides strong authentication. Change the default community strings to something cryptic like a strong password. You want to configure SNMP agents to respond only to pre-programmed IP addresses, and then also disable, remove SNMP agent software if you're not using it at all. And also consider using IPsec to encrypt your SNMP traffic if you're still using version 1 or 2. Remember we talked about LDAP, your Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Now it uses X500 naming scheme for objects in the directory. This naming scheme uses distinguished names to identify objects within the directory. So you can see here we have a listing. My recommendation here with Active Directory, LDAP specifically, which runs on port 389. And also there's a secure LDAP, which runs off of port 636. So LDAP 389, secure LDAP 636. And basically here, if you look at the format of how things are actually pointed out, so as you see we have the CN equals, OU equals, and DC equals, and so forth. That's going to be the format that you're going to see. So anytime you see anything like this, just know that it's LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Now there are tools that you can actually use for Active Directory enumeration. Again here, using LDAP Miner. And anonymous queries will fail if LDAP null-based queries are disabled. And the usage would be something like ldapminer.exe with the -h for the host, and then whatever options. Just keep in mind the default port number is 389, and then you have some other options there. Main thing here is just to know what tool that you can use to actually enumerate some Active Directory, in this case, using LDAP Miner. Countermeasures, block ports 389 for LDAP. You can also block ports 3268 for the global catalog, and do this on your firewall servers, as in on your firewalls. Remove the Everyone group from the pre-Windows 2000 compatible access group. This pre-Windows 2000 group by default has read permission on all objects within the Active Directory database. Now, if you need to protect against external employees, set the organizational unit permissions such that users in other organizational units cannot read, as in remove the authenticated user's read permission. This will then also limit the information they will retrieve. Null sessions, awesome stuff. Now, with null sessions, pretty cool stuff. We basically have an anonymous connection that we are allowed to do, and we can retrieve certain information such as username, groups, shares, and services from that. Now, null sessions take advantage of features within the server message block protocol that exists for trusted domains to enumerate resources, external computers to authenticate and enumerate users, and the system account to authenticate and enumerate resources. Generally, ports 139 and 445 on the TCP side is required to be open in order for a null session to be successful. It also needs to be able to connect to the IPC $ first. It's very straightforward to use, right, when it comes to null sessions. So it allows us to connect in. We have to have the correct usage, so keep in mind it's going to be net space use space / the IP address / IPC $ space double quotes space / u or user colon double quotes. And this basically allows us to log in as an anonymous user with a null password, basically. All right, and that's pretty much what it's going to look like. You need to know that. Now, obviously, here we see the net use, and using net view to see what's actually shared out and so forth with that. And again, once we have this established, as you saw, we can use other tools like dumpsec that will allow us to go in and then enumerate users and things like that. Now, which we'll talk about in the password section here when it comes to system hacking and stuff. When it comes to passwords, we'll mention things like the SID account, the security identifier, which is basically where we have the S number, and then at the very end we have the 500, which is always going to indicate our default administrator, but then we also have other numbers and so forth. But we'll talk more about that when we talk about password cracking and such, but at least we have a little forward on that. But anyhow, as you can see here, we're shown here in null session to 10.1.1.201 and a list of shares on that machine. And there's other tools we can use to retrieve information from the target machine, as we've seen in the demo using dumpsec, for instance. We can also use Kane enable to create a null session. And it's pretty straightforward when it comes to Kane enable and how to do that. We just double click it, as in we put in the name, we right click the quick list, put in the IP address. Once that comes up, we just double click and voila, it creates an anonymous connection. And this basically takes us back down to the review of everything we've just talked about. Now, we talked about a lot of information. And with this, we've also covered a lot of practice questions or a lot of questions and such that we come across. So just to kind of recap, right, when it comes to the reconnaissance side of things, right, we're basically doing reconnaissance, which includes everything from social engineering, right? We have active and passive reconnaissance. We've mentioned perhaps dumpster diving, which is also part of reconnaissance because you're trying to grab information from the trash can and so forth, right? It's also part of social engineering type of scenario. Things like the different types of hackers and so forth that we talked about in the first module too. Some other things that we perhaps didn't mention, which I'll show you right now, which is very important. Actually, we may have seen this in the previous thing on Central Ops, but it's something called the robots text file. And the best thing for that is I'm going to show you guys a demo on this that will actually show you the robots text file. And it's going to be very important that you know what it is, what it does, and this demo will actually show you how to go about doing that. Let's see, other things that we talked about. We talked about Google, right, and the different types of things we can use. We talked about Tor and using an anonymizer and things like that, right? We talked about different ways we can actually gather information off of other machines using different types of scanning methods, such as doing OS fingerprinting, things of that nature. We talked about information such as getting whois information. This is where we talked about the reconnaissance and what the attackers are actually gathering, and we're trying to figure out things like who registered the domain and when it expires and things like that. So that way we can actually send the administrator that signed up for that an email saying, hey, your domain name's about to expire, and you need to click on this link to renew it, kind of thing. In reality, that's actually then going to a different website, which then allows us to grab some some data. Right, we talked about the 5 phases, right, the 5 hacking phases, right, gaining access. We basically get into things like escalating privileges, executing applications, hiding files, and then covering our tracks and such. Now we also mentioned things like reconnaissance, scanning enumeration, right, maintaining access, and then hiding files and so forth, and of course covering our tracks and things to that nature that we've kind of mentioned. At least we're mentioning here again on that. So, all right. So other things are things like we talked about banner grabbing, or looking at the operating system banners and how we can use that via telnet to the port 80, things like that. We've talked about different social engineering type scenarios. Again, you should be able to identify any social engineering type of attacks and so forth along with that. Other things is the protocols and the different scans and so forth that we looked into, right? We talked about the half-open scan, we talked about the connect scan, talked about the fin scan, the null scan, the Xmas scan, things like that. We talked about the different flags that we associate, the three-way handshake, ICMP. This is where I ask you also to check out some of the ICMP reply codes and so forth, going to the protocols.com website and checking those and studying that. We talked about different port numbers that we've needed to know. Everything from port 445, which is SMB over TCP/IP, all the way down to port SSH, which is port 22 for SSH. We also have port 123, port 389 that we talked about, which is for NTP and LDAP that we just discovered. We also talked about some of the default stuff, such as IIS-6 for 2003 server. IIS-7 is basically a 2008 server. We mentioned idle scanning, things like that, right? The connect scan, all that good fun stuff. We were able to look into some of that. We saw HPing in action and how we can utilize HPing for, in that demo case, a denial service type scenario, and how we can use a SYN scan with it and such. We talked about SNMP, DNS, SMTP, and things like that. So again, knowing just those little pieces of information will definitely get you through a lot of different things. Now, I mentioned about ports 514, which is used for syslog, right? And so any kind of log messages and so forth are going to be running off of port 514. Now, other things is, as I mentioned, with the 9100, which is basically your jet direct that comes to play there, and such. Other than that, we are ready to move on into the next section, which is going to be system hacking. And here we'll talk about things like password cracking. We'll talk about things like ADS, your alternate data streams. We'll talk about how to hide our files, and how to erase them, and things like that. How to clean up our tracks and the such. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop on into the next section to get some more things covered.